Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to our series about Massey is Missing COP26, about climate change. And today we're going to talk about climate change and trade. But first, let me say that Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are acknowledging the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. Today is a great day to be talking about trade and climate change because we constantly struggle with whether they are complementary or whether they are in conflict. And that will be the subject of this discussion. I want to thank Rosemary McCartney and Diane Sachs, who have been putting together this series on Massey is Missing COP26. It was a fabulous series, and I know it will continue next year, so thank you very much. And today I want to thank our moderator, Ambassador Jonathan Freed. Welcome him to Massey. We've had occasion to meet before, and I'm delighted that he's helping us. And I want to just say that I'm also recognizing that Professor and Ambassador Stephen de Boer was a student of mine way back when. So I am delighted that he's coming to Massey as well. So welcome and enjoy the discussion.
Good day, everyone, and welcome, and thank you to Madame Desrosiers for the introduction. As she mentioned, this is one of a Massey College series on various dimensions of climate change. So if, as I hope and expect, you enjoy this session, then do subscribe to Massey College's YouTube channel to see the other sessions in the series and to learn about other events. Today, we're very privileged to bring together truly eminent and very expert individuals to talk about the subject of the relationship between tackling climate change and promoting jobs and growth through trade, which is so important to Canada's economic prospects. Since our time is limited and each of our participants has a great deal of insight to share, I'm not going to dwell on introductions because that could take up the full hour. I encourage you, however, to look at their individual biographies, which are on the website for this event. I'm not going to say much more other than to see if we can dive into this subject. Let me start by turning to Catherine, or Kat Abreu, who leads the Canadian chapter of the Global Climate Action Network, and she's among the leading voices at home and abroad for a green economy. So to set the stage for us, Kat, could you set out for us just how much of a threat to our future climate change presents, and particularly with an eye to the next big global discussion of the challenge at COP26, as it's called, at the end of the year? What will Canada and other countries seek to do to transition to a green economy, and is trade relevant to that climate agenda? So over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and hello to you. So good to be with you today, and thanks to Massey College for hosting. Always a pleasure to be back with some of my fellow U of T alum and current students. Although I did not go to Massey College, as was established in our pre-meeting, I went to New College. I'm calling in today from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in what's also known as Ottawa, and I think this is a really great question to start off our conversation today, Jonathan. So, maybe let's start by taking stock of where we're at. When it comes to global climate change, the UN estimates that global temperatures have warmed by about 1.2 degrees Celsius since in pre-industrial levels. That number comes from 2019. So we're already pushing up against the threshold for warming that global scientists have told us we need to hold to if we're going to avoid some of the most catastrophic and irreversible impacts of climate change. And that threshold is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that number, 1.5, is of course baked into the Paris Agreement, where parties, all 195 signatories to the Paris Agreement, have committed themselves to making their best efforts to hold global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And why is that important? Well, because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, told us with their 2018 report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, how much of a difference even 0.1 degree of warming can make. We see huge escalations in climate impacts that many communities around the world are already struggling with when we have that 0.1 degree difference. And it's the difference between points of a degree that can determine whether an ecosystem collapses entirely and therefore gives us no chance of recuperating it, or if we are able to keep that ecosystem in a state that it can be restored from. So global coral reefs are a good example of this, where if we are able to hold warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 90% of global coral reefs will die off, but that keeps about 10% of the coral reefs with us to restore them. Whereas if we go over that 1.5 degree tipping point, all the coral reefs are dead and there's nothing for us to build back from. So that's really the story that we're working with here, that already the world has warmed by a huge degree. We're seeing the impacts, and we need to be working hard to avoid some of those irreversible impacts in the future. Here in Canada, our climate is warming even faster. So Canada is warming about twice the average global rate. Our temperatures have gone up about 2 degrees Celsius here in Canada since pre-industrial levels. It's even worse in the north, where warming is happening about 3 times the average rate. So we're seeing communities here across Canada experiencing the impacts of more extreme fires, floods, permafrost melt, sea level rise. When it comes to the pandemic, I think a lot of us have been hearing about the ways in which emissions have gone down over the course of the COVID-19 crisis, and the ways in which some ecosystems have started to bounce back with reduced pollution and human activity. But I think one of the most valuable lessons that we've learned from the pandemic is the way in which those emissions are released. So we stopped all human activity around the world for a bunch of time, including a lot of air travel. And scientists are estimating that emissions went down about 17% in the early days of the pandemic. And overall, in the past 18 months, emissions have gone down perhaps around 7%. So that means that most of the emissions are actually coming from industrial sources that us as individuals don't have a whole lot of control over. And many of those industrial sources of emissions, of course, come from the oil and gas sector. So what are we expecting to see in the coming months as we lead up to COP26? Well, we're already seeing a bunch of doubling down on commitments for climate ambition from countries around the globe. The US is back in the mix, of course. President Biden hosted a big summit on Earth Day on April 22nd, where we saw a slew of new climate commitments come from countries. So a commitment from the US to reduce emissions 52% by 2030, from the UK to reduce emissions 78% below 1990 levels by 2030. It's a huge, huge move by 2035, sorry. And a new commitment from Canada to reduce emissions 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. The trouble is, Canada has never met a climate target that we've set. And so if we are going to deliver on this most recent commitment and do better than that, which we have to do to get closer to our fair share, we have our work cut out for us. And that means we need to be using every lever at our disposal to help us transform our economy to a less carbon intensive economy and deliver our fair share on climate to the world. And that's why trade matters. So I'll just finish my opening answer to your question with a couple of thoughts on why we should be talking about trade and the interconnections with climate change. First of all, almost 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to be embedded in goods that are traded internationally. So huge implications globally of trade around the world and what that means for emissions profiles. For Canada specifically, some of our largest traded goods are in the energy and automotive sectors. Those are both very greenhouse gas intensive sectors. And so if we think about our export economy, it's a relatively greenhouse gas carbon intensive sector. So we need to be thinking about how to substitute some of those exports for lower greenhouse gas emissions and how we enter into trade agreements that help support that decision for us to transform away from a greenhouse gas intensive economy toward a cleaner economy, as we also transform our industrial sectors and think through what that means for our workforce. So we need to be having trade agreements that are helping us meet our international commitments when it comes to climate, and also not hindering us from implementing our own domestic environmental policies, which we have seen trade agreements do in the past. Canada has been taken to court many times for delivering on domestic environmental regulations and policies, and that running counter to the interests of some private sector entities that we've been engaged with in trade deals. So those are a few opening thoughts of what the situation is, where the world is going in the lead up to COP26, and why we need to be thinking about trade and all of that.
Thank you so much, and it's a nice segue, if not an open invitation, to Ambassador de Boer. Stephen, as a dear friend and colleague, you bring a real wealth of experience, not only in trade, but previously in environmental matters, to your current role at the WTO as ambassador, and I understand you're leading discussions on trade and environment. CAP didn't quite say so, but a number of advocates would say that the free trade agreement framework provided by the WTO and agreements pursuant to the WTO are effectively barriers to countries being able to take measures to address climate change. So what's your reaction to that alleged criticism?
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in today's event. And I do hope I can add some value to our discussion on what is personally and professionally a very important topic. And as you alluded to, Jonathan, in my former life, I was Canada's Deputy Chief Climate Change Negotiator. And I participated in climate negotiations and understand how climate change can be both a unifying and yet incredibly divisive topic. And it's fantastic to see so many countries now coming out with more ambitious emission reduction targets. And I'm hopeful that COP26 later this year will see greater convergence and cooperation on climate change. At the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that while the COP sets the targets countries will aim for, the actions needed to achieve these targets must come from other fora, and this includes the WTO. I strongly believe that trade policy must play a central role in addressing climate change, as well as other global sustainability challenges. It's inconceivable to think otherwise. And in my opinion, trade can play an incredibly important and facilitative role in helping us reach our climate change objectives. I think it would be useful to unpack trade policy's potential contribution in addressing climate change by considering two broad questions: how we trade and what we trade. The first question is all about analyzing how trade rules can support the broader fight against climate change, and whether we need to think about whether we need new trade rules or approaches to support climate change policies. And I think here a good example is border carbon adjustment and how such a tool would interact with trade rules. BCAs are increasingly coming up in conversations at the WTO, particularly since the EU signaled that it was working on implementing one as part of its Green Deal. While there's increasing attention to the topic, the familiarity and understanding of BCAs amongst WTO delegates remains relatively low. In March of this year, as part of Canada's international leadership on trade and environmental sustainability issues at the WTO, we organized a very well-attended workshop on BCAs at the WTO. The workshop was not meant to promote a specific view or approach to BCAs, but rather to provide WTO delegates with an overview and appreciation of the main considerations at play and how they might interact with existing trade rules. The workshop was very well received and underlined the interest amongst WTO actors on better understanding the issue. It's clear that the developing world and/or those countries with heavy reliance on exports of GHG-intensive goods are most worried about the impact of BCAs on their economic competitiveness. These are valid concerns, and these countries have every right to raise them at the WTO. This is why we need to use the organization as a platform to have meaningful and open discussions about the interrelationship between trade rules and climate measures. BCAs is only one example of where trade rules and climate measures will intersect. There are other examples, such as fossil fuel subsidy reform and technical barriers to trade. Clearly then, trade rules are one dimension that we need to look at carefully. The other side of the coin is to look at what we trade and consider how trade rules can help promote the trade of goods and services that would help address environmental sustainability issues like climate change. Is it a question of tariffs, of technical regulations, or are there other trade policy levers that could help? In addition to facilitating access to environmental goods and services, how can trade rules help address other challenges like plastic pollution, trade in illegal lumber, or implementing a circular economy? It's through increased transparency, regulatory coherence, or is it through other measures? Another important aspect is to consider how trade rules can contribute to efforts to build back better and to create a more sustainable and resilient global economy after the COVID pandemic. I think we can agree that there's no shortage of issues where trade policy has an opportunity to play an important role in supporting global efforts to meet sustainability objectives. All of the issues I've just outlined are important, relevant, and pressing. Equally, a large subset of WTO members seem eager to discuss some or all of these topics. This level of enthusiasm and interest is fantastic and a welcome sight. Our challenge now is to direct this enthusiasm into a credible and realistic way forward. We won't be able to do everything at once. To try to do so would be a recipe for failure. So how do we do this? Well, in Canada's opinion, we need to do something that the WTO hasn't traditionally been very good at: asking stakeholders for input and views. Ultimately, the WTO does not and cannot work in a vacuum. In order to advance our work, we need to break down silos and engage with others. Earlier this year, Canada was part of a group of 50 WTO members that launched the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions. And I'm one of the co-chairs of the structured discussions along with my Costa Rican counterpart. The objective of the structured discussions is to provide a forum for interested WTO members to discuss and deepen their understanding of issues at the nexus of trade and environmental sustainability. Perhaps the most important or innovative aspect of the structured discussions is that a small group of external stakeholders, for example, NGOs, academia, and the private sector, are participating. While the decisions as to the work to be undertaken at the WTO will continue to rest with the members alone, we hope that the views expressed by stakeholders will provide important context and direction. Looking ahead, we plan to issue a statement on trade and environmental sustainability at the Ministerial Conference at the end of November, or MC12, with the intention of laying out a concrete plan of action in the period leading up to MC13. Our hope is that this declaration will be supported by as many WTO members as possible. In addition, my expectation is that this ministerial declaration will be joined by other declarations on issues like plastics, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and potentially on environmental goods and services. Each of these declarations would be supported by a different constellation of WTO members based on their interests and priorities. MC12 represents an important opportunity for WTO members to send a clear signal of their intention to meaningfully contribute to global efforts to address environmental sustainability priorities. The signal is as much to do with the relevance and credibility of the WTO as it is to do with the future health of our planet, and Canada will be there to do its part. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you. Let's try and complete the picture with Simine. You're globally recognized as an economist who, over many years, have studied and made very pointed recommendations for governments and the private sector alike on the business impacts of climate change, ranging from innovation to sustainable finance. So in the real world, when we read about corporations paying more attention to so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance responsibilities that business is supposed to pursue, how would you describe the intersection of trade and climate for the private sector these days?
Well, thank you for this question, Jonathan. I'd like to offer 3 points on the intersection of climate, trade, and the private sector. First, let me start by saying that the publicly traded companies that are leaders on the climate dimension of ESG are now being rewarded by capital markets for doing so. Now, that's a big deal. And the premium for these climate leaders, in terms of the way their companies are valued, it can be very significant. It can vary from 15% to 150%, depending on the sector. The companies these companies are in highly competitive sectors, including steel, cement, chemicals, and electricity generation, as well as services in other industrial sectors. And this research has been undertaken as part of my role as an associated partner at Kearney, and I believe these findings are quite noteworthy. Climate leading companies also have strong governance and social performance, and by virtue of the premium capital markets are giving them, have a lower cost of capital, have access to deeper pools of capital, and can enjoy brand and reputational advantages. So ESG leaders enjoy a virtuous cycle of business advantages leading to stronger competitive position. The second point I wanted to offer is that these leaders also leverage the structures that integrate the private sector with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. This was inspired 7 years ago by the Lima Paris Platform principles, which were translated into, get ready, this is a very sexy title, the Non-State Actor Zone for Climate Action, or the NASCA, which is an online portal hosted by the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change. And this year, in preparation for the meeting in Glasgow, COP26, under a banner called the Race to Zero, the NASCA now mobilizes a coalition of leading net zero initiatives representing cities, regions, companies, as well as some of the largest investors in the world and higher education institutions like the University of Toronto. Globally, there are now 1,500 companies that are taking action, with more than 700 that have science-based targets, and close to 600 of these are committed to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which Kat mentioned a moment ago, which signifies at least a 45 to 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, and in many cases, more than that. So a third of those companies, close to 600, as I mentioned, of those, there are 28 companies that have science-based targets that are Canadian, or about 2%. And of those 11 have all set targets of reductions of 45 to 50% reductions by 2030. And they're names that some of us would recognize: Arc'teryx Equipment, Selectica, Cogeco, Thomson Reuters, Lululemon, Crystal Clear Cosmetics, TELUS, McKean's Foods, Multiplex Construction, and WSP Global. So those are some of the ways that the private sector are working at the intersection of climate, and obviously as they are businesses of trade as well.
Let me play devil's advocate with each of you, just to draw out expectations. So COP26, Canada falling short, We're also seeing, of course, partisanship continue in the United States, meaning that President Biden's targets may not be fully endorsed or implemented by a divided Congress. We read about China continuing to consume more than its share of coal and is one of the world's largest emitters. India, of course, distracted rightly by the more immediate COVID challenge, remains a major emitter. So I guess the question that, Kat, you can enlighten us on is, what's a realistic expectation for COP26? And similarly, Ambassador, you outlined a series of very lofty declarations for MC12 around the same time as COP26, but it's exactly that, it's declarations. So what's a realistic expectation for concrete results from the WTO forum? And Celine, we read about ESG, we know a number of companies put it into their annual report, but we also read about so-called greenwashing, that people choose the criteria by which to measure themselves just to claim credit and to attract investors, but there may not be enough meat behind it. So there's the skeptic's view for each of you, and maybe you can reassure me and our listening and viewing audience on each front. Kat, can we turn to you in COP26?
Yeah, sure thing. So, every year, the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, publishes what's called the Emissions Gap Report, which measures the distance between the commitments made by parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and parties to the Paris Agreement. So it measures the commitments they've made versus what they've committed to under international treaties to hold warming to. And so last year, we saw the UNEP emissions gap report tell us once again that if you add up all of the commitments made by various parties to the Paris Agreement, it gets us to at least 3 degrees, if not 4 degrees of warming. So well above that 1.5 degree threshold that we were mentioning earlier in our conversation. These are commitments, though, right? And I think, Jonathan, your point around there being a big difference between commitments and statements of solidarity and support and ambition, and when the rubber hits the road and what that actually looks like in the implementation phase. And I think something that we have to keep in mind is everything's going to look impossible until you really get down to business and get it done. And so the focus right now, from my perspective, must be across the board in jurisdictions, bending the emissions curve now. And we've seen a number of countries that have been successful in doing that. So they've been meeting their 2020 emissions reduction goals and the Kyoto Protocol. They've been working to decouple their GDP from greenhouse gas emissions. So, I'll pull out a couple of examples. You mentioned China. China is on track to overachieve on their emissions reduction goals in the next decade. That means that they will hopefully be putting more ambitious commitments on the table in the future. But the reality is that while China's emissions continue to rise, their per capita emissions are extremely low. And they arguably have less of a historical responsibility for the problem of climate change. And so while we, yes, need to be expecting more ambition from countries like China or India, where, again, emissions are growing as governments seek to provide essential services like energy access to all of the citizens. There are still millions of people in India who don't have access to electricity. But even in India, we're seeing a huge outgrowth of solar energy. So in that country, solar energy is the cheapest form of energy around. And there's actually been great strides made in solar implementation there that are help scale up solar energy elsewhere in the world. And again, their per capita emissions are really low. So from my perspective, where we need to be looking for those deep emissions reductions are from developed nations like Canada, because we have a historical responsibility for the problem and a need to do a whole lot more than the global average. And so I'm really looking to industrialized nations like Canada to bring that level of ambition to COP26, and in particular to start talking about what that means for the wind down of oil and gas. So the International Energy Agency released this roadmap to net zero in 2050. We've been hearing all these countries make net zero commitments. And what they said is, that means that there can be no new investment in oil and gas production projects, and that there's a huge scaling down in oil and gas that happens and a ramping up in renewable energy. And so I'm expecting at COP26 that we'll not only be seeing some of those more ambitious commitments, hopefully in particular being driven by wealthy industrialized nations, but that we'll get a real conversation on the supply side of the equation, on how we are going to actually manage the decline of the oil and gas industry and take care of people at the same time. Because we can't just keep paying attention to, we can't just keep cutting with one side of the scissors, to quote a famous paper on balancing the demand with the supply side of action.
Thanks. Stephen, in Geneva at the same time at the end of the year?
So I would say a couple things. I think we need to make a distinction about what is doable now and what we might think about for MC12. And I think it's worth remembering that there are a number of tools in our trade policy toolbox already that could facilitate action against against climate change. And one of them is a carbon tax. A carbon tax is completely consistent, depending on how it's applied, but in general, it's completely consistent with the WTO rules. And my suspicion is that the conversation in the EU and also in the United States around border carbon adjustment will encourage some members of the WTO to start thinking more seriously about a carbon tax. The other thing I would say is there's nothing to prevent members now from devising climate change policies that are consistent with the current rules. So that is outside of the larger WTO discussion. In the context of the WTO, yes, you're right, and you're right to be somewhat skeptical about what a declaration might do at MC12. But a declaration could point to a number of outcomes that could be quite useful, and some of them might be more plurilateral. So on plastics, for example, that has a lot of support from a country like China. Or re-engaging on the environmental goods agreement, which is a plurilateral outcome. It doesn't require 164, or potentially a plurilateral outcome, doesn't require 164 members to sign on to it. But I would also say this about declarations. You need to start somewhere. And if we can get as many members, ideally the entire membership, to agree that we need to take action to address climate change, that's a very important step to start talking about some of the trade policy changes that would be required in order for us to get there. So in short, I would say that there's nothing to prevent countries from taking certain actions immediately, and I can't predict how that will happen. And longer term on the road to MC12, I would think that the most interest being generated right now is around reviving the environmental goods agreement negotiations.
And just to elaborate for our audience who may not have been following its earlier incarnation, and to repeat or to draw out what you referred to earlier, an environmental goods agreement would eliminate tariffs on goods that contribute to improving the environment, including climate. So filters and cleaner technologies and so on would make such products available at lower cost without the tariffs, and therefore by being deployed and shared around the world should contribute to reduced emissions. So that's been on the table for a while. So Celine, on the private sector side, I pose the question of people or companies inventing their own standards just to claim victory. How should we read annual reports, and is there a need for international standardization of measuring the private sector's contribution to the environmental side of ESG?
Well, that's a great question, and that work has been underway for a long time under the greenhouse gas protocols that were that were agreed to and that were facilitated by the World Resources Institute. And so there is a standard as to how companies should report their greenhouse gas emissions. And investors are now, I think, quite well aligned along a very clear ratio, which is really simple. It's emissions divided by revenue. And whatever industry you're in, you get compared versus your peers on emissions divided by revenue. And I just recently did some benchmarking along those lines, and there's a very wide range. And the companies that have poor rankings can expect that they will have shareholder resolutions similar to the ones that occurred just last week at both Exxon and Chevron, where shareholders came to the table and very small minority shareholders brought forward resolutions to change directors and were successful. And so, I would say that the standards have been in place, are widely agreed to, and can be audited. That the ratios are now increasingly clear and being used to compare companies within sectors, and the consequences are frankly getting clearer by the day. So, I think investors are going to be very busy over the course of the next 12 months making resolutions and voting on resolutions as to the adequacy of climate plans. And if directors are not replaced this year, then it won't be long after that if there isn't a reasonable not just a commitment, and it's one thing, as Kat rightly points out, to make commitments, but it's another thing to achieve on those goals. And so the same criteria applies to the private sector as does to countries that are raising their ambition in terms of commitments, but need to deliver on those.
Thank you. So I do want to leave time for questions and dialogue with the audience in the remaining time in the hour, but one more quick question that each of you may wish to comment on. In effect, our conversation so far tells us that a range of government interests are obviously engaged, whether it's a trade ministry, an environment ministry, an industry ministry, or a finance ministry, for that matter. Internationally, there are discussions at the WTO, discussions at COP26, and we hear and read about the G7, the G20, APEC, and so on. So let me ask the same question from opposite sides. Are each of you satisfied that in Canada or other major countries, governments are well enough coordinated on these various fronts to have coherent vision of marrying the economy and climate? And then conversely, if I'm an interested stakeholder, whether I'm a citizen activist or a private sector actor, do I have to go running around the world to so many different forums and venues to have my voice heard, or is there a better means of dialogue between the stakeholder community and the government level or international level policymaking community? Who would like to start with that? Kat, maybe you're on behalf of the Climate Action Network, which is global and an advocacy group among other objectives. Maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share, Jonathan, that a part of our work at Climate Action Network Canada is helping Canadian civil society navigate many of these multilateral spaces and agreements and figure out how to plug them in and try to work as a bit of a central clearinghouse for some of that feedback so that, we're the ones holding those relationships with all those multilateral spaces, and we can do that on behalf of our membership of 130 organizations across the country so that each of them doesn't have to do the same, because it is, you're right, a very well-populated space. I think there are a couple of points I would make on that front. First is, if you're a citizen who's curious about how to drive these issues, really the biggest tool that you have at your disposal is your vote and your rights and your obligations as a citizen of this country to hold your elected officials accountable to your expectations of what they're going to do on climate action and to their international commitments related to climate action. So, climate change is really a nonpartisan issue, and I think we perhaps are still getting to the point in Canada where most Canadians feel comfortable going to their elected official, regardless of their party affiliation, and asking them to take action on these issues. When it comes to expressing expectations around improving performance, improving delivery on some of these commitments to climate action, we also, I think, should be figuring out how to hold private corporations accountable. So, we heard some really interesting examples from Céline about the ways in which ESG is being incorporated into some private sector areas, but we also see many private sector actors making net zero commitments that don't have a whole lot of substance behind them, and so we should be demanding to see that substance. And we should be figuring out how to hold those corporations that are responsible for the majority of global emissions accountable. So we've actually seen some really interesting developments on that front recently, with Shell being ordered by a Dutch court to reduce its emissions 45% below levels by 2030. Chevron's shareholders voted for targets to reduce Scope 3 emissions, and they voted against management on that. Activist investors recently got 2 director positions on Exxon's board. And so that's another area, I think, where there's maybe been a bit of a dearth of engagement, because we've been counting on governments to hold the private sector accountable. But when governments fail to do that, I think citizens can step up and do the same. And we've seen some really big wins on that front in recent past.
Ambassador?
Yeah, so I would say that there's a lot more work to be done. I don't think that we have created the narrative or the value proposition that says we can create growth and better jobs and a better economic future and address climate change. I don't think we're all pulling in the same direction yet, and that is the value proposition. I mean, the work of the WTO is about better jobs, about generating economic activity for us, for citizens. So we need to create that narrative and show that it can be done and show the creativity. And I would also say, on the question of coordination, here in Geneva, the WTO sits in rather splendid isolation. We don't actually talk in a meaningful way, or very much at all, to the UNFCCC, for example. So those crosswalks are not being created, and there's much to be done to facilitate that level of cooperation and coordination. One of the values of these structured discussions that we're having at the WTO is to bring up the knowledge, to talk to stakeholders and say, okay, how do we do this, and how do we bring that value proposition to the WTO? So a lot more work needs to be done.
Just very quickly, before turning to Céline, with your co-chair from Costa Rica, are there public summaries or documents that come out of your structured discussions, or they're informal and off the record to facilitate dialogue?
That's an excellent question. I think that the sessions that involve stakeholders, they were public. So whether there's a summary of them, I have to follow up. We just had the last one last week, and I haven't seen anything yet, but I suspect that it's public.
Because you've been engaged with stakeholders beyond the delegations in any event.
Yeah, exactly.
And Céline, how many different agencies, organizations, ministries do you have to deal with in private sector regulation, if Catherine hasn't taken over as a shareholder yet? So.
Well, the sort of the 2021 version of the NASCA platform is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So it's not sort of a general non-state actors platform, but it's for all financial institutions, and it includes The UN convened Net Zero Banking Alliance, the UN convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, of which CDPQ, which is one of Canada's largest pension funds, is a founding member. So those are all the pension funds. And then it also includes the insurers as well as the asset managers. And so what I would say is, as a citizen and as a Canadian, you could always just ask your bank, write to your bank and say, are you a member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance? I can tell you, I looked it up. And as far as I can tell, there are no Canadian global systemically important banks that are members of the Alliance. I'm very happy to report that Vancity was a founding member. But there are 3 large US banks and 8 European and UK banks. And so there's something that each of us could do, which isn't very complicated. And I would also say, if your community or your academic institution or your city is not a member of the Race to Zero, then maybe you can be in touch with the UK embassy and ask them how you could make that happen.
Thank you all. Let me turn to our technical hosts and see if there are some questions that we can answer. So the first one that comes up goes back to something Stephen highlighted, which is a border adjustment tax. And although you're sitting in Geneva, obviously, Stephen, you'll have some insights, as will our other panelists, on how this would work in a North American context. If we've got an integrated economy and goods are crossing the border 3 or 4 times from inception to final production, how are we going to administer the border between us? Do we have to harmonize? Will there have to be an extensive negotiation, or it's too early to know? Let's start with the ambassador.
Well, it's really early to know, but I've been operating on the assumption that it would absolutely have to be harmonized. I mean, we're essentially talking about one economic space, and so I would imagine that it would be the same rules, so that we would avoid paying the border carbon adjustment, because we will have harmonized our policies and our rules. That doesn't get around the challenge. I was going to say problem, but I'll say challenge with respect to goods from third parties. And look, I think this is going to be complicated. It's being led right now by the EU, and the EU and the US will want to talk this through. And Canada will very much want to be on the inside, working towards as much harmonization as possible. And it is certainly my hope that within the CUSMA space, so Canada, US, and Mexico, that we would be closely aligned. But it is very early to tell.
Kat, Celine, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll hop in on this question, because I think, so something I should have said at the outset, which is a part of the reason I think that we're part of this conversation, is that we at Climate Action Network sit on the domestic advisory group for CETA, the Canada-EU trade agreement. And so there are increasingly these spaces that are opening up to help bring civil society perspectives into the trade conversations. And a part of what we've been considering in that group is the EU's work on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are, of course, an attempt to address the potential for carbon leakage from between jurisdictions when a jurisdiction in a trade agreement may have stronger climate and environmental policies than another jurisdiction, or to avoid competitiveness issues on that front. But I think, while it's interesting for us to continue having these conversations, and I was really intrigued to learn that the US and Canada are having some of those conversations as well, as the ambassador said, it's still very much an emerging conversation. And it isn't the only way in which we can make use of trade deals to try to enforce environmental and climate performance. So, an example of what else we might turn to is prohibiting fossil fuel subsidies, right? So we actually saw in the same way that trade deals tackled fisheries subsidies in the past, there is some precedence for trade agreements helping to mitigate some of those kind of harmful financial instruments. So I think that, if we can explore some other ways, perhaps making sure that future trade deals are compatible with ambitious climate action, so that they discourage the expansion of fossil fuels and require export and import controls of fossil fuels. So those are a couple of other examples of how we might make sure that trade agreements are aligned with domestic as well as international climate commitments. CBAM is one part of the equation potentially, but it's not the whole picture.
Celine, do you want to add?
Yeah, what I would say is that trade agreements have always begin with a deep analysis of the trade flows, right? And then move from there. And I think in this instance, we actually need to almost rethink that, because we know, for example, that the International Energy Agency's 1.5 degree scenario would basically have us no longer have any trade in internal combustion engine based cars by 2040. So if that's the case, and the private sector has absolutely prepared for this, we have very specific commitments for the sunset date of the sale of internal combustion engines by all major manufacturers in the Canada, US, Mexico vehicle supply chain. Then how are we going to make sure that any border carbon adjustment negotiations consider the future, not just the past, because that's where the business is moving towards. And one could say the same thing, obviously, for the technologies that are required to make industrial sites carbon neutral. By 2030, we'll need to be implementing 10 of those a month. It's going to be an incredible pace. And so, we're going to need really robust supply chains for that. And the same thing obviously goes to, multiplying by a factor of 4 all of the renewable energy investment and deployment in both solar and wind. And so how will our trade thinking reflect the future and use a 1.5 degree aligned scenario as the basis of those thoughtful negotiations?
Maybe I'll add one footnote to all this. If I understand correctly, just to reinforce what the ambassador said, these are early days, because some of the discussion is whether one proceeds actually sectorally with an adjustment tax. That agriculture, for example, may be so complex with so many stages, nobody's ready to assess the border on agriculture, but cement or steel becomes a very, sorry for the pun, concrete example of something that can be measured and taxed to avoid the leakage. We have time for one or two more questions, I think, if there are. We've talked a lot about the big players, China, United States, Europe, and of course Canada in this equation. The question is about small island states close to home in the Caribbean, the Pacific Island states. We read about Maldives falling below water with the ocean rise. Any comments on the particular challenges of the small island states in a global context? Are there voices heard
maybe
at
I can
or at the WTO or private sector? Any of the three, given the short time available?
I'll just quickly say that the small island states are taking an important leadership role in the discussions at the International Maritime Organization and the decarbonization of international maritime traffic, which obviously is fundamental to trade. So I think that it's that the IMO in negotiations are I guess I'll say fairly nascent, and it's certainly impressive to see the role that small island states are taking in that setting.
And yet another forum you've identified of a multilateral organization in that mix for this pervasive agenda. Kat, Ambassador, anything to add, or that captures it well?
Well, I would say that in the WTO context, it is clear that small island states have particular challenges because of the structure of their economies, their population base, and also because climate change has meant increased environmental degradation and destruction. And so they have been, CARICOM has been very articulate at the WTO. The OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, has been working very hard on some of these issues. And it's very important to understand where they are coming from, because their issues are quite unique from other developing countries. But I have been impressed while I'm here at how articulate they are in pushing forward those issues. But the issues are unique compared to others, absolutely.
Thank you. Kat, if nothing to add, maybe we can squeeze in one last question, and then we'll also invite each of you to share closing thoughts. So going back to something that Kat mentioned, is there a conundrum in light of COVID? Here we are seeing massive amounts of money go out the door for building back and allegedly building back better. Are you optimistic that the post-COVID recovery will actually accelerate the move to meeting climate commitments, or is the race out the door to create jobs and employment something that may run counter to the green transition? I'm asking for a bit of political economic prognosis here.
So my read is that so far it's a real mixed bag. If we think about the 2008 recession and the fact that emissions went down then and then increased exponentially afterward during the recovery period, there were a lot of mistakes made in that moment that I think should be learning from as we recover from COVID-19. And indeed, we see some jurisdictions do seem to be learning from those mistakes. So, a huge portion of the recovery budget from the EU is dedicated to green recovery. They are using this moment explicitly to try to turn the wheel of these huge economic actors, in particular the kind of macroeconomic fiscal actors, the banks and the insurers and whatnot, to shift them more toward sustainable investments and to give the banks a taxonomy for more sustainable, to make sure that their portfolios are more sustainable, because we see in many jurisdictions, like in Canada, that banks tend to be really overly leveraged on greenhouse gas intensive investments like oil and gas. We're seeing something similar in the US, where the Biden administration has put $2 trillion on the table for economic recovery, and much of that is dedicated to green recovery, to renewable energy investments and other clean investments that are going to turn the tide in that country. Are we seeing the same thing here in Canada? In some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. The scale is really much smaller here. And I think we have some catching up to do when it comes to really thinking through that level of industrial planning we might be seeing in other parts of the world. So I think, in short, the commitments are going up. We've already seen huge new commitments, some real game-changing interventions put into the mix, and whether we actually see that implemented and whether this moment of disruption is kind of used to turn the ship is another question that I think we'll have to have a conversation about in a year or so.
Celine, Stephen?
Well, I have to say that I agree with much of what Catherine has said. I guess I could add that central bank policy is one which obviously has had an important role in this at this particular point in time. I think Canada put forward a really strong policy in terms of its industrial assistance requiring commitments to TCFD and disclosure of any company that took large-scale industrial assistance from the federal government. That policy wasn't in place at the Bank of Canada, for example, and so it's not that Canada is distinct in this regard. It's been the case across the board. Having said that, there are many examples of companies that are now getting a break on the interest which they are paying for corporate lending because they are achieving on emissions reductions, on social dimensions in their ESG programming. So we know this is possible, and it's going to accelerate over time. And obviously the EU's commitment to use 37% of 750 billion euros is going to inject quite a lot of capital in the low carbon, zero carbon economy. So we can see markets are going to grow as a result.
So I would agree with Catherine that this is a mixed bag, and it's probably a mixed bag going forward as well. And moving forward is something that actually causes me a lot of concern. There's a couple of things that are happening here. The one is, the money is being shoveled out the door, and is it going to the right places? The second question is, where are governments getting this money, and what's going to happen when we need to pay the piper? And so I'm thinking, and that could have both good and positive aspects to it. So that might actually animate the domestic support discussions on agriculture, because maybe countries can no longer afford the high level of domestic support. That actually would be good for the climate. That actually would be good for the world economy. But on the other hand, we also have challenges. How are governments going to pay for this? We've already seen riots in Bogota, where governments cannot afford to feed their people, to create jobs for their people. And what does that mean for our world trading system? And what does that mean for any attempts to address climate change? Unfortunately, climate change starts getting bumped down the hierarchy of needs when people are hungry and people don't have jobs. And so there could be a lot of unintended consequences that I think are quite worrying as we move forward. How's that for cheerful to finish this off?
Well, we've reached our time, but I'm going to try a little more hopeful wrap up here, because what I take from this wonderful and very rich exchange is, contrary to the initial billing, we're not talking about two solitudes here. That in the respective communities, those engaged in the climate have a full appreciation of the economic dimensions of a green transition. And conversely, those who are champions for the benefits of trade are increasingly sensitive to the climate and environmental dimension, including through Canadian leadership on both sides of the equation. While we've each identified very much work in progress, and the fact that there's more to be done at COP26, at the WTO, in the private sector, with central banks, with the International Maritime Organization, and so on, there is engagement ranging from individual citizen interest right through to private sector, to governments, to the international organizations themselves. International Energy Agency, International Maritime Organization, in addition to the ones we've focused on here, the WTO and COP26, and then all the affiliated forums and gatherings, whether it's G7 or G20 or APEC or otherwise. That gives me cause for some hope and optimism that going forward, with the support and engagement of the public policy community, the private sector, and those engaged at the government tables, we may continue to make progress, notwithstanding the pressures that you, Ambassador, just identified, where obviously the health, safety, and basic nutrition of your population, of course, can't help but be imperative. So let me just see if there's any last comments from any of our three esteemed participants here, and if not, we can thank everyone for participating and their engagement. But last word over to each of you.
I'll just say thank you. It was a great conversation. I know we're already past the hour, so lots to talk about maybe next time.
Thanks very much to Massey College, and thank you all, my esteemed colleagues.
Yes, thank you, and let's have a next time. I agree. Take care.
Indeed, and that's a good reminder. If people enjoyed this as much as I did, and it sounds like all of us did, then do sign up, follow the rest of the Massey series. They have put onto YouTube previous sessions, and as we heard from Madame de Rosier at the start, there is an intent to carry this forward into next fall. So let me thank on behalf of everyone the very thoughtful, insightful observations and insights shared by each of you. And thank you all. Thank you. All the very best.